I never wanted my name on the building. That was Edward's thing. Plaques, dedications, the newsletters with his photo on the front. I was happy being the one setting up chairs, brewing the coffee, cutting the sandwich triangles for visiting donors. He called me the engine behind the foundation, but I was just his wife, his quiet partner. The woman who stayed late after everyone else left, sweeping the desert dust off the front steps so it looked good in the morning light. I didn't want recognition, I just wanted it to matter. And for a long time, I thought it did. Edward and I started the Desert Foundation in 1989 in the back room of the old county library before they replaced the windows and installed central air. Back then, it was just an idea, a scholarship for one student, maybe two, from the rural border towns where kids worked weekends at gas stations or helped their parents clean motel rooms. He said, "They need someone to believe in them." And I said, "Then let's stop talking and do it." That was our rhythm. He'd dream it. I'd build it. We didn't have much. Edward was still teaching full-time at the state university, and I worked at the local school cafeteria. But we had $3,000 saved from a canceled vacation and an old Rolodex filled with former colleagues and church friends. I made the calls. I wrote the first donor letter on a typewriter with a sticking space bar. And when we got our first $1,000 check back in the mail from a retired professor named Louisa, I cried in the driveway. The foundation didn't grow overnight. It grew like cactus roots, slow, invisible, stubborn. The kind of growth you can't see until one day a flower blooms in a place you thought was barren. We moved operations into a small one-story building on the east side of Tucson. It had peeling paint and a leaky roof, but it was ours. I turned the storage room into a tiny greenhouse. It was silly, really, just 3 shelves of succulents and desert roses, but Edward said the students loved it. They like to see something growing, he told me. It reminds them what they can become. For the next 30 years, we handed out scholarships, hosted community nights, partnered with local schools, and created mentoring programs. I planned the banquets, managed the volunteer schedule, and filled in as receptionist when our admin staff quit during the holidays. I never asked for a title. Edward offered once, wanted to name me co-director, but I told him, "Let people see your name. I don't need it." And maybe that was my mistake. I look back now and wonder why I believed that being quiet was the same as being respected, that staying in the background would mean people remembered who was holding it up. Amber came into the picture about 10 years ago. Our son married her, and for a while I was grateful. She was sharp, good with numbers, and had experience with nonprofit accounting. Edward brought her in as a consultant, then a staff member, and eventually gave her access to the administrative accounts. "She's young, Irene, but though," he said. "She's going to help us scale this thing." And she did, sort of. The donations got bigger, the board meetings felt more corporate. She introduced project management software I couldn't figure out and started calling the scholarship recipients impact stories. But I stayed out of the way. That's what I always did. Even when Edward got sick, I stayed quiet. I handled the hospital schedules, the chemo appointments, the pain meds, the insurance fights. I slept in the hospital recliner for months. Amber, to her credit, handled the paperwork. She talked to the lawyers, kept the meetings going, told everyone the foundation was transitioning smoothly. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to think about a future where he wasn't around to explain it. Now, I wish I'd asked more. When people tell a revenge story, they picture a woman throwing a drink in someone's face or slamming a door in a courtroom, but not all revenge comes loud. Sometimes it looks like an old woman digging through a file cabinet at midnight, holding a paper she should have read a year ago. Sometimes it looks like silence that speaks louder than the accusations. Back then, I still thought silence was strength, that keeping things peaceful was my duty. I didn't know yet that the world had already started to forget me, that my name was already fading from the folders, from the boardroom agendas, from the history of what we built. There's a photo in the foundation's front hallway. It's from the 25th anniversary banquet. Edward is standing next to the mayor, shaking hands, smiling. Amber is behind them with a clipboard. I'm off to the side, barely in the frame, holding a plate of cookies. People walk past that photo every day. Some of them know who I am. Most don't. but I remember everything, and I've kept the records. After Edward passed, the silence in the house felt heavier than the grief. Grief was sharp, unpredictable, but silence. It lingered. It crept into the hallways, into the kitchen drawers, into the seat across from mine at breakfast. I didn't clean out his side of the closet. I couldn't. His cufflinks were still in the dish by the mirror. His glasses were still on the desk. The foundation sent flowers, a public condolence statement, and a framed print of one of Edward's quotes. "We plant not for ourselves, but for futures unseen." Amber handled the funeral. Efficiently, of course. The service was precise, modern, tasteful. Slideshows, soft piano music, imported lilies flown in from California. I just sat through it, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. People patted my hand, said he would have been proud, told me how lucky I was to have had such a partner. No one asked me if I needed a ride home, not even Amber. She stayed behind talking to the press. A few days later, the locks on Edward's old office at the foundation were changed. I found out when I dropped by to return one of the scholarship plaques. It had been accidentally mailed to our house. I walked up to the door, tried the key, and felt it jam. One of the interns saw me struggling and came over awkwardly. "Oh, I think Amber had the locks redone last week. Something about digital access now. I can let her know you stopped by?" I waved it off, said it wasn't urgent, but the truth settled in like sand under my nails. She hadn't told me. No email, no text, not even a courtesy call. That weekend, I drove out to the greenhouse on the east end of the property. The plants were still there, but fewer. Some had been moved, others were gone. My favorite aloe, 20 years old, wasn't on the windowsill anymore. A laminated note on the table read, "All donations and displays to be cleared or rotated by Jan, one for rebranding." Rebranding. A week later, I received an email, not from Amber, from her assistant. The subject line read, "Estate Administration Meeting, scheduled, with a time, date, and downtown office address." No greeting. No, "How are you holding up?" Just coordinates, like I was a courier, not a widow. I remember staring at that email for a long time. I forwarded it to myself twice just to make sure it was real. The morning of the meeting, I got dressed slowly. Navy sweater, slacks. I even wore the earrings Edward bought me for our 40th anniversary. Tiny silver leaves. I left the house early, sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside. I didn't want to cry in that conference room. I didn't want to give Amber the satisfaction of seeing me break. The office was all glass and soft lighting. A receptionist handed me a visitor badge and offered tea, then added, "You're Irene, right? You'll be sitting on the end." On the end. There were already 6 people seated around the polished table when I walked in. Attorneys, 2 financial consultants, Amber at the head. She didn't stand, just looked at her tablet and gave a small nod like I was a late RSVP. I sat where they told me to. No one slid a folder my way. No one made eye contact. I folded my hands and waited. Amber spoke like a PowerPoint presentation. Per the terms of the revised trust, dated February 18th, full administrative and financial responsibilities have been transferred to the executive director, myself, for the purpose of streamlining operations, ensuring long-term scalability, and honoring Edward's strategic vision. She didn't even say, "my father-in-law." Just Edward, like he was a brand, not a man. My name wasn't mentioned once, not in the financials, not in the transition terms, not even in the section about memorial designations. It was as if I had never existed. When one of the junior lawyers finally asked, "And Mrs. Caldwell's share or roll?" Amber didn't even blink. "There are no distributions assigned to her under the current structure." I sat there, perfectly still, as if any movement would confirm how hollow I felt. Amber closed her files, offered a polite smile, and the meeting was over. Before I left, I paused at the door, looked back one last time. Not one person looked up, not one goodbye. Have you ever felt erased while still standing in the room? It's a strange thing to realize that the people who once hugged you at Christmas now treat you like a technicality. that the work you once poured yourself into can be overwritten with a meeting and a few quiet signatures. If you've ever felt that, like your years of sacrifice got swept under a rug, just drop a yes in the comments. I promise you're not alone. That afternoon, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold. I looked out at the backyard, the same yard Edward used to rake every Sunday morning. His boots were still by the door. His cane leaned against the bookshelf. I hadn't touched a thing, but the foundation had. Amber had, and I knew then. It wasn't grief that made the air feel cold. It was erasure. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if being silent was the right thing anymore. I didn't cry after that meeting, not in the elevator, not in the car, not even when I got home. But that night, something inside me shifted, like a door had quietly closed behind me, and no one noticed I was still standing on the other side. I sat in Edward's chair at the kitchen table, his chair, the one that always squeaked when he leaned back, and I stared at the tiled floor. It had a crack in the corner from when we dropped the crock pot one Thanksgiving. He always said he'd fix it. One of these weekends, he'd smile. But now there were no more weekends, and the crack was still there, just like me, still here, still waiting. The house felt different, not in a haunted way, just quieter, like it had taken a breath after realizing it no longer needed to hold space for me. The next morning, I opened the mail and found a glossy newsletter from the foundation. The cover had Amber's photo on it, welcoming our new executive director. It said in gold cursive. There was a paragraph about honoring Edward's legacy, a quote pulled from one of his old speeches, and an announcement about a new donor initiative in his name. There was no mention of me, not even as his wife. I wasn't thanked. I wasn't acknowledged. I was simply missing. I flipped to the back. There were photos from the last scholarship banquet. I had baked 6 pies for that event, pecan and apple, from scratch. I stayed up until midnight the night before. In the pictures, Amber was shaking hands. A board member gave a toast. Students smiled in their pressed shirts and borrowed blazers. But I wasn't in any of the photos, not even in the background. That afternoon, I opened Edward's desk drawer for the first time since he passed. It wasn't planned. I just walked into the study and did it, like my hands had moved before my thoughts could catch up. The drawer creaked the same way it always had. He used to joke that the sound helped him think. If it's too quiet, he'd say. I start hearing my own excuses. Inside were receipts from book orders, old ballpoint pens, and a few envelopes I didn't recognize. One was from a legal firm I didn't know. Another was addressed to Edward, unopened, dated just 2 months before he died. I didn't open them that day. I couldn't. I just sat there, holding them, feeling like a trespasser in my own home. Later, I called Amber. I don't know why I did. Habit, maybe, or some thread of decency I hadn't let go of yet. She didn't pick up. I left a message. Hi, Amber. I just wanted to talk briefly about the newsletter and, well, a few other things. I hope you're doing okay. Call me when you can. She never called back. That night I made dinner for one. Tuna salad on toast. Edward hated tuna, said it smelled like wet paper. I laughed thinking about it, then felt stupid for laughing. I left the second plate empty, then scraped it clean and put it away without eating. That was the week the cane went missing. His cane. The one he left by the back door the day he came home from chemo. I kept it there, leaning slightly on the frame. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that I'd moved it in a fog. But I looked everywhere. It was gone. That cane meant something to me. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was the last thing he used before he couldn't walk anymore, before Amber took over the daily schedules, before he started meeting with lawyers alone, before I was asked to rest more and trust the process. And now it was missing, like so many other things. His notebooks, his voice recorder, his backup planner, all the little pieces of him that once filled this house, quietly slipping away one by one. At first I thought maybe someone was helping clean up, trying to ease the transition, but the more I looked, the more I realized what was happening. I wasn't grieving. I was being erased, piece by piece, page by page. A gentle disappearance, just quiet enough to seem reasonable, just slow enough that no one would notice. Have you ever looked around your own home and felt like a stranger in it? I remember walking into the study one evening and realizing that nothing in that room had my fingerprints anymore. The plants were dying. The calendar was blank. His coffee mug was gone. Not cleaned, just gone. That was when I stopped pretending it was just grief. That was when I started counting what had been taken. It started with a drawer I wasn't supposed to open. The bottom one, left side of Edward's desk, the one he always kept locked. But I found the key behind a loose baseboard under the window, right where he used to hide the Christmas cash for the grandkids. I don't know what made me look. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was that sinking ache that happens when you finally realize everyone thinks you're done and gone. The drawer wasn't full of money. It wasn't dramatic like that. It was just paper. Files. Things Edward had written in the last year of his life. Notes. Letters. Unsigned forms. There were receipts from meetings I never knew he attended. Minutes from board sessions I wasn't invited to. Drafts of revised trust documents. But with his handwriting in the margins. Not Amber's. His. And the handwriting told me more than the typed words ever could. One file was labeled "For Irene," see if needed. I sat down carefully. I hadn't seen Edward's handwriting since before he got too weak to hold a pen. It was messy, but still his. In the folder, he'd tucked an original copy of the Desert Foundation's first charter, dated and notarized with both our signatures. Mine, scrawled confidently in blue ink. His, written just beneath. I hadn't thought about that document in years, but there it was, clear language naming us as co-founders and co-trustees with equal decision-making rights unless formally amended in writing and with consent of both parties. There was no formal amendment. I checked again. There was an email printout from our old lawyer, Robert Salinger. Edward, as discussed, Irene remains listed as full co-trustee under the original agreement. You would need to file formal changes with the state and her signature to revoke that. Happy to assist if you move forward. Dated 6 weeks before Edward died. And then a note. Not typed, not formal, just a yellow sticky with shaky pen lines. If she ever gets cut out, it wasn't my doing. Don't let them take it from her. I sat with that note for a long time. I read it maybe 10 times. I whispered it out loud like I didn't believe it. Don't let them take it from her. And something in me cracked open, not loudly, not like a scream, just a small, clean snap. The sound of a woman who'd been silent for too long realizing she wasn't crazy. That the erasure wasn't accidental. That someone had seen it coming and tried in his own quiet way to leave breadcrumbs back to the truth. I put the papers in a folder, marked it in red ink. Foundation Originals, PIE, Private. I locked it in my own cabinet, away from the house. That night, I went outside and looked up at the stars. Edward and I used to do that all the time. We'd sit in lawn chairs, count how many planes passed overhead. He'd say, "Someone's going somewhere bigger. We're just the steady ones holding the light." Well, the light was fading, and I had to decide whether to let it go or relight it myself. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet. I needed to be sure. So I reached out to Robert. Same lawyer from the email. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. He sounded surprised when he answered, like he didn't expect I'd still be involved. "Irene," he said slowly. "It's good to hear your voice. I was wondering when you might call." That told me everything. I asked him if we could meet, not at his office. I didn't want Amber getting wind of it. We met instead at a small diner halfway between Tucson and Green Valley, someplace neutral. I brought the file, I brought the email, and I brought the note. He read them carefully, then looked up at me with that tired expression lawyers wear when they realize someone's been wronged, but the system won't make it easy to undo. "Irene," he said carefully, "if these are the only documents on file, then legally you're still co-trustee, and any actions that removed you without consent are challengeable." "Challengeable," I repeated. "But reversible? With the right evidence and timing, maybe. But it'll be quiet. These things don't go to trial, not usually. They're cleaned up quietly, behind closed doors." I nodded. That was fine with me. I didn't want noise. I wanted the truth. He paused. "Do you want to fight this?" And for the first time, I didn't hesitate. "No," I said. "I want to finish what we started." I didn't wake up one morning suddenly stronger. There was no music swelling in the background, no fiery speech in the mirror. It happened slowly, quietly, like how desert mornings turn from cold to warm without you realizing it. Just a soft, steady change you only notice when you look back. After my meeting with Robert, I began keeping a notebook. Not for revenge, just for truth. I wrote down every donation I remembered approving, every school we visited, every event I planned. I listed names of volunteers, board members, even the janitor who stayed late with me once to mop the hall before the spring fundraiser. I was writing history. Not their version, mine. I pulled out old receipts from the garage, found handwritten thank you notes from scholarship students tucked inside cookbooks, and dusted off a stack of cassette tapes Edward used when practicing speeches. In one of them, he says clearly, "Irene's the backbone. I just talk loud." I smiled at that, not because it was sweet, but because it was proof. I still didn't say anything to Amber. I didn't march into the foundation. I didn't call board members or make a fuss. I just gathered, quietly, precisely, deliberately. Every night, one more document scanned, one more folder labeled, one more memory pinned down before they could rewrite it. And during the day, I planted, literally. I reopened the greenhouse on the east end of the property. Not the new glass one Amber had ordered last year for public tours, the old one. The one Edward and I built ourselves with salvaged windows and too many screws. It had been neglected, but the bones were good. Just like me. I replaced the broken panels. I swept out the dead leaves. I repotted the surviving succulents and added herbs I knew the kids from the food co-op could use. No ribbon cutting, no announcements, just a handwritten sign at the gate. Mrs. Caldwell's garden, all are welcome. Word spread faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, 3 of the students from last year's grant program came by to help. One brought his little sister. Another brought a basket of lemons from home. We didn't talk about the board, or the funding, or Amber. We just watered things and talked about life. One of the students, Mateo, said something that stayed with me. He was transplanting basil when he looked up and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, you're still part of this, right? Like, no matter what happens?" I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "I never left." That weekend, I emailed Robert a full timeline. No dramatic language, just the facts. Dates, records, notes. I ended it with a single line. "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm reclaiming what was never theirs to erase." He replied, "Understood. This is solid. We'll begin with the Foundation's legal framework." Quietly. I nodded to myself. That was all I needed. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my oldest friends from church. People didn't need to see the fight. They just needed to see me standing. I started dressing better again. Not fancy, just sharper. My mother always said, "How you dress tells the world whether you remember yourself." I'd forgotten for a while, but now I was remembering. I went to a bookstore and bought a fresh planner. I signed up to volunteer at the Adult Literacy Center again. I started making my own coffee in the morning instead of waiting to feel needed. And one day I stopped checking Amber's name in the paper, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need her to lose for me to win. See, this was never about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about someone finally saying, "You were there, you mattered, you still do." And if no one else would say it, I would, to myself, for myself. It didn't happen in a courtroom. There were no headlines, no angry emails, no dramatic shouting in a boardroom, just a letter, neatly folded, printed on letterhead delivered to my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Caldwell, this letter serves to confirm your formal reinstatement as co-founder and co-trustee of the Desert Foundation, effective immediately. Your rights to participate in board decisions and legacy designation are restored in accordance with the original charter filed 1989. There were 3 pages. I didn't read them all. I didn't need to. I just held the paper in my hands and closed my eyes. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even about the title. It was about being written back into the story I helped build. Amber didn't call. She didn't have to. I knew the move came from pressure. Quiet pressure. Legal nudges, board whispers, maybe a few of the older donors starting to ask, "Where's Irene in all this?" I didn't need to hear her voice. I didn't need an apology. The silence was enough. I made a copy of the letter and placed it in the folder marked Foundation Originals, Private. Then I sat at my garden bench, under the shade of the lemon tree Mateo planted last month, and watched the wind lift the pages of my notebook. The greenhouse was blooming, not wildly, just enough. The students came by every other day now, sometimes with snacks, sometimes just to talk. We didn't talk about Amber or the foundation. We talked about jobs, about mothers, about dreams that felt too small or too far away. And sometimes they'd ask about Edward. "I didn't know he played guitar," one of them said after seeing the old case in the corner. "He didn't," I smiled. "He bought it and never learned. Said he liked the idea more than the work." We laughed. That felt good. Last week, I was invited to a private donor dinner, one of those formal things with cloth napkins and tiny desserts. I almost said no, but then I thought, no, you built this. You can sit at the table. So I went, not dressed to impress, just simple, elegant, me. When I walked in, a few people turned. I caught someone whisper, "That's Mrs. Caldwell." Another nodded. Then came the slow ripple, the polite greetings, the hesitant, "It's so good to see you again," the small acknowledgments. And then, the moment I didn't expect, one of the new board members, a woman in her 30s, stood to give closing remarks. She talked about legacy, about sacrifice, about how the foundation was built not just by vision, but by unseen labor. And then she said, "I want to thank the woman whose name is sometimes missing from the official records, but whose fingerprints are everywhere. Mrs. Caldwell, you didn't just support this mission, you embodied it. We're honored you're here tonight." There was applause, not wild, not theatrical, but real. And I didn't cry. I just nodded, softly. When the dinner ended, I didn't stay to mingle. I stepped out into the parking lot, took a deep breath, and looked up at the stars. Edward would have said something cheesy like, "You've always been the real North Star." I could almost hear it. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in the car and let the silence hold me for a while. Not heavy this time, gentle. Have you ever won something without raising your voice? Have you ever had the truth come back to you like a slow sunrise after a long winter? If you have, I'd love for you to tell me about it. Just a few words in the comments. I came back. That's all. I promise. Someone out there needs to see it. The next morning, I made coffee. I fed the cat. I walked through the garden and pruned the tomato plants. Then I sat down and wrote a check. Not to the foundation, to a new account. The Irene Caldwell Fund for Invisible Labor, a scholarship for women over 60 who gave their best years to building something and were told their name wasn't needed. It wasn't revenge, it was restoration. And sometimes that's the loudest kind of justice there is. Healing didn't look the way I expected. It wasn't grand or loud. There were no camera flashes. No one rang a bell and declared, "She's back." Instead, it looked like waking up and not feeling dread. It looked like making oatmeal and humming to myself. It looked like walking past the framed photo of Edward without my chest tightening. It looked like breathing, fully, freely. Somewhere in the middle of sorting old papers and planting new herbs, I had started to become someone I hadn't seen in decades. Me, not Mrs. Edward Caldwell, not Amber's mother-in-law, just Irene. I remembered I used to love poetry, that I hadn't written a line since the year Amber took over most of the foundation's publications. Not because she stopped me, she never said I couldn't. I just faded out. Let her voice fill the room while mine got quieter. That's what happens when you're trained to be helpful. Your silence becomes your service. But now, I wrote. Little things, one verse at a time, on notepads, on the backs of envelopes, on recipe cards I found in drawers that still smelled like cinnamon. Irene, The woman who used to make coffee for every volunteer before they even arrived. The woman who knew which student's mother had passed away, who needed a coat, who didn't eat lunch because they were saving food for a sibling. That woman had gone quiet. Not because she forgot how to care, but because the world told her she wasn't necessary anymore. And now she'd started talking again. I began taking longer walks, not to lose weight, not for steps, just to feel the world, the warmth of the pavement, the breeze on my arms. I'd stop to pet the neighborhood dogs, talk to the high schoolers waiting for the bus. One of them called me Miss I. I didn't correct him. I liked it. The greenhouse had become a community space in every sense of the word. Mateo brought in a friend who'd just gotten out of a rough foster situation. She didn't say much at first, just helped water the plants and sweep up. One day she stayed late, asked if she could leave a drawing pinned up on the wall, a sketch of hands holding roots. "It's not for sale," she said shyly, "just for here." I nodded. Then it belongs. Things like that kept happening. Quiet kindnesses, little ripples, people bringing their own healing into a place that had once been built on mine. Amber hadn't reached out since the board letter. I didn't expect her to. And strangely, I didn't resent her anymore. Not because I forgave her, but because I no longer needed her to see me in order to see myself. Sometimes the most dangerous thing they take from you isn't money or status. It's the mirror. The version of yourself that says, "You're still here, you're still good." And I had that mirror back now. One Thursday afternoon, I ran into an old friend at the post office, Marlene. We hadn't spoken in years, not since our husbands were both on the same fundraising committee. She looked me up and down and said, "You look different. Better or worse?" I smiled. She grinned. "Better, like someone who stopped waiting for permission." That night, I wrote in my journal, "I think I finally left the waiting room. Not the physical kind, the emotional one. The place we older women are pushed into once they've taken what they need from us. Our time, our nurturing, our patience, and left us behind like a burnt-out light bulb. But I wasn't burnt out. I was just getting started again. I began organizing the greenhouse's first community open day. Not a grand event, just a welcome back forgotten people kind of gathering. I invited the scholarship alumni, some old staffers, and a few neighbors who'd never been part of the foundation but had always asked about it. No press, no speeches, just connection. We served lemonade and rosemary cookies, played soft music. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years, deep green with a little gold thread. People came, and when they left, they hugged me like someone they didn't know they'd missed. It felt full, not flashy, just full. And sometimes I wonder, how many of us are walking around feeling empty simply because we were written out of the chapters we helped build? If you're reading this, and you've ever felt like that, like your season ended before you were ready, just know you're not alone, and your story isn't done. I never planned to become a teacher again, not officially, not with a chalkboard or lesson plans or a certificate. But somehow, life had other ideas. It started with Mateo asking if I could help him write a grant proposal. He was nervous, said he didn't know how to sound professional. So we sat in the greenhouse with 2 cups of lemonade and walked through it line by line. I didn't change his words. I just helped him shape them, cut the clutter, find the pulse, show his heart without apology. 2 weeks later, he came back grinning. "They gave it to me," he said. "I got the money. I'm starting the garden at the shelter." I cried, quietly. The good kind of crying. The I still have something to offer kind. Word got out. That's how it always happens. Not through flyers or Instagram reels, but through whispers, stories. Miss Irene helped me. She listens. She gets it. Soon after, I found myself holding evening sessions at the greenhouse. No formal sign-up, just an open door on Wednesdays and Sundays. Young women came, some students, some caretakers, a few just lost and tired. We didn't sit in rows. We sat in a circle. Sometimes we read essays. Sometimes we just talked. One of them, Janelle was 24. She dropped out of nursing school after caring for her grandmother full-time for 2 years. She said, "I used to feel like I was wasting my potential. Now I realize I was practicing compassion." I told her, "That's more than half of leadership right there." Another girl, Destiny, worked 2 jobs and still showed up with calloused hands and sharp questions. She wanted to start a food pantry in her apartment building. "Do you think people will take it seriously?" she asked me. "I think people are starving for seriousness," I told her. "Start anyway." And they did. Little ripples everywhere. One by one, I watched them become who they were meant to be. Not because I gave them permission, but because I reminded them they never needed it. Sometimes I sat in the garden after they left, thinking about how many years I spent doubting my worth when the truth was, everything I needed to give had only just begun to bloom. Amber's name hadn't come up in months, not in my circles anyway. I heard she was traveling, speaking at conferences. Good for her. I didn't carry bitterness anymore, just boundaries. Edward used to say, "If you want to see if your work matters, plant a seed and walk away." If something grows, it was never about you. It was about what you left behind. I'm starting to believe that now. I didn't build the greenhouse again to prove anything. I built it because the world needed more spaces where older women weren't just seen as wise, but active. Still planting, still showing up, still shaping the story. The foundation didn't reach out to me officially again, but I started receiving updates. They now included my name in newsletters, quietly, in collaboration with Irene Caldwell, not front page, but there. The board even sent a small thank you plaque for my continuing legacy. I smiled when I opened the box, not because I needed the gesture, but because it no longer had the power to define me. I had already defined myself. One afternoon, while tidying the greenhouse, I found an envelope slipped under the door. No name, just a note inside. "Because of you, I didn't give up. I'm still here. Thank you." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just 7 words that reached into my ribs and tugged. And I thought, that's what we're all really asking, isn't it? Not to be praised, just to be seen, to be told we're still here, and that we matter. It started with a phone call I didn't expect. "Mrs. Caldwell?" The voice was young, unsure. "My name is Trina. I'm interning at the foundation this summer. I've been going through the archives. Are you available to talk? I have some questions." I paused, surprised. "Questions?" "Yes," she said quickly, "about your early programs, the Family Literacy Initiative, the lunch partnership with the school district. There's barely anything detailed in our records, but your name keeps showing up in donor letters and newsletters from the 90s. I smiled. "I suppose people used to write things by hand back then." She laughed. "They did. And they wrote about you. A lot." We met 2 days later in the greenhouse. Trina arrived with a spiral notebook, 3 pens, and an energy I hadn't seen from the foundation in years. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened. She took notes without interrupting. And when we wrapped up, she looked around and said, "Why hasn't this space ever been featured in our tours?" I shrugged. "It didn't fit the brochure." She scribbled something furiously. "It fits now." A week later, I got an invitation in the mail. Desert Foundation 40-Year Legacy Evening, in gold lettering beneath it, honoring those who built the roots. I laughed. Not bitterly this time, just softly. The event was held at a restored mission hall, arched windows, candles on the steps, the kind of place people dress up for even if they're just serving cookies. I didn't RSVP. I didn't need to. I just showed up, quietly. When I entered, people turned, the way people do when they recognize something they hadn't seen in years, but feel they always should have. Amber was there. Of course she was, standing near the center in a sleek beige suit, speaking with donors. She didn't wave. She didn't scowl either, just watched me, carefully, like she wasn't sure how to rewrite this scene. I didn't go to her. I went to the side of the room, near the display boards Trina had mentioned. One caught my eye. Irene Caldwell, the forgotten chapter. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual. Images of our early years, testimonials from students, a timeline that named the projects I launched, many of which still ran even if no one remembered who started them. In the corner of the board was a small quote I had written in a grant memo long ago. "Give them roots, not branches. If they grow strong, they'll build their own trees." A young man I didn't know tapped my shoulder. "Are you her?" I blinked. "I'm sorry?" He pointed to the board. "Mrs. Caldwell. My mom was part of the literacy group. She always talked about the woman who told her she was smart before anyone else did." I nodded slowly. "That sounds like me." He smiled. "I just wanted to say thank you. You helped her change her life. She helps mine every day." It's funny, the way recognition finds you not when you shout for it, but when you've stopped needing it. Later that evening, Amber took the stage. I thought she might avoid naming me, might keep it vague, but she didn't. Instead, she cleared her throat and said, "There are people who build things loudly, and there are people who build quietly, who never ask for credit, but whose fingerprints are on everything we touch. Tonight, we're correcting a silence." She turned slightly toward me. Just slightly. "Mrs. Caldwell, thank you." There was polite applause. A few people stood, but I didn't cry. I just smiled and nodded. Not for her, for myself. That night, after the event, I sat in my car a few minutes before driving home. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I felt like a page had turned. Not in someone else's book, but in mine. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not the parade, not the plaque, not the public moment, just the quiet knowing. They see you now. But you've already seen yourself. Have you ever felt like someone finally saw the value you always knew was there? If so, I'd love to hear your story. Just drop one line in the comments. "They finally saw me." Someone in our little circle might really need to read that today. I'm not sure what I expected when the mail arrived that Tuesday afternoon. A large envelope, cream-colored, stamped with the foundation's emblem, a stylized saguaro cactus. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of crisp, embossed stationery. "Mrs. Irene Caldwell, co-founder and co-trustee emerita. It is our honor to invite you to serve on the inaugural Emeritus Council of the Desert Foundation. This advisory body will guide our strategic direction and uphold the mission you and Dr. Caldwell established 31 years ago. We look forward to your wisdom, your insight, and your continued presence. Warmest regards, Amber Caldwell, Executive Director." My first thought was, Amber wrote this? Part of me braced for a trap. But as I held the letter, I felt something soft and unexpected. Validation. Quiet, yes, but unmistakable. I carried it into the kitchen and set it next to my teacup. The steam curled up like a question mark. I took a slow sip. No sugar today, just the warmth. Later that afternoon, I sat in the greenhouse pruning the rosemary. I ran my thumb over the envelope's edge and thought, do I want to do this? I didn't need another title. I didn't need more responsibility. But the real question was, do I want to keep watching from the sidelines? I tucked the invitation into my notebook and kept working. Each twig I trimmed felt like I was shearing away doubt. By dusk, the rosemary looked neat and trimmed, ready to flourish. Have you ever been offered something you never asked for, but felt in your bones you'd earned it? If so, drop a quick "me too" below. I promise it's safe here. We've all been sidelined, waiting for our turn. The next morning, I made the call. Robert Salinger answered on the first ring. I told him about the letter. He chuckled softly. Well, that's a first. They're finally doing it by the book. I said, I think it's time I did it by my own terms. He agreed. Let me know how I can help with the paperwork. Then he paused, asked, will you take the seat? I said, yes, and hung up. That afternoon, I went to the foundation office, past the sleek lobby, past Amber's office, into the boardroom where I'd once been treated like an outsider. This time, things felt different. The long polished table, the leather chairs, even the windows overlooking the courtyard. It all looked familiar, like an old friend. People stood as I walked in. Interns, staff, longtime donors. I nodded and offered a small wave. No grand entrance, no applause, just recognition. I sat at the head of the table in the chair Edward used to claim. Amber handed me a folder labeled Emeritus Council Charter. I opened it and skimmed. Purpose: to advise the board on mission alignment, to mentor young leaders, and to preserve the original ethos of the Desert Foundation. I closed the folder gently. "Thank you for this honor," I said. My voice was steady. "I accept, but with one condition. We'll meet here, in the greenhouse, at least once a quarter." A murmur of approval. Amber smiled. "Of course." I leaned back and looked around. The faces weren't new to me, but the roles had shifted. Now I was the elder stateswoman, the keeper of memory. A week later, I received another envelope, this one handwritten in looping script. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell, I was one of your first scholarship students back in '91. Thanks to you, I became the first in my family to graduate college. I started my own nonprofit last year to support refugee women in Phoenix. I wanted you to know, every time we help someone rebuild their life, your work lives on. Gratefully, Lena Rosa." I folded the letter and held it. Lena was a name I hadn't heard in decades. I remembered her shy smile, her first timid letter asking for help with campus housing. I had written back, assuring her we'd find a room. She'd graduated with honors. I put Lena's letter in my journal and sat in the greenhouse, letting the stories of generations wash through me. The courtyard beyond was quiet, but in my mind, I heard laughter, recitals, scholarship banquets. They say revenge is sweetest when it's quiet. I think that's true, but there's something even sweeter, witnessing the long arc of kindness you set in motion. That week, I drafted the first agenda for the Emeritus Council. Review ongoing scholarship programs. Mentor grant applicants. Plan an annual Living Legacy event in the greenhouse. Establish a fund for women over 60 pursuing second careers. I emailed it to the board. As soon as I hit send, a calm settled over me. This wasn't about me regaining power. It was about making sure the foundation stayed true to its roots. Roots I had planted, watered, and never let die. The following Wednesday, the greenhouse was humming with life. The interns set out name tags for the first emeritus meeting. The scent of citrus from the lemon tree mingled with the earthy green of basil. I walked in and saw Amber already chatting with Dr. Morales, one of the longtime donors. She spotted me and came over. She offered her hand, her real hand, not the executive director's handshake. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you did and still do." I squeezed her hand. "We only succeed when we remember where we started." But what I didn't say was, revenge is letting the world circle back, not burning it down. The foundation's legacy wasn't built in moments of drama. It was built in decades of careful, patient tending. That afternoon, I sat on my garden bench under the lemon tree, Lena's letter in my lap, Emeritus Charter in my bag. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the path. I closed my eyes and felt the breeze, warm, forgiving, filled with promise. I had asked for nothing, and yet here I was, steward of the past and guardian of the future. And sometimes, that's the quietest, most powerful kind of justice there is. I walked into the community garden just as the early spring sun was cresting over the distant mesquite trees. Rows of daffodils and tulips glowed in soft yellow and pink, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of damp earth and new beginnings. It felt like coming home to a place I'd built with my own 2 hands and heart. And yet this season, it belonged to an entire community. I paused at the entrance gate, letting the familiar rhythm of dripping sprinklers and singing sparrows wash over me. I remembered the first bulbs Edward and I planted here, long before the foundation ever had a name. Back then, it was just a dusty patch next to the old community center, and I kneeled in that soil with calloused hands and hopeful dreams. We laughed as we got dirt under our nails and promised that our work would last beyond our lifetime. Those bulbs were small acts of faith, tender gestures in a harsh desert. I never imagined I'd one day return to find a forest. A group of volunteers was already gathered by the potting bench, chatting and sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. Faces familiar and new turned toward me as I wound between the raised beds. A young woman I recognized, Maria, who had received a scholarship 10 years ago, smiled and waved. Behind her stood her son, holding a watering can almost twice his size. They rushed over and embraced me. "Mrs. Caldwell, it's so good to see you," Maria said. "The garden saved me. Now my little boy learns here." I followed them to a cluster of early lilies blooming in a corner bed. Their petals were still unfolding, delicate as whispers. I knelt down to inspect the shoots, brushing a petal with a fingertip. In the soft soil at the base of one stem lay a small pot with bright purple pansies and a folded note tucked beneath. I picked it up gently, unfolding paper that carried the familiar handwriting of a former scholarship recipient. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell, because of your faith in me, I studied horticulture and now coordinate the city's Flower Forward program. Every spring, I remember that you planted seeds of hope long before the world saw your name. These pansies are for you. Thank you for helping me bloom. Holly Martinez." My heart trembled as tears welled. Holly's note was an echo of so many lives I'd never fully tracked. Tiny acts that rippled outward in ways I couldn't have imagined. I pressed the note to my chest, inhaling the sweet floral scent, and whispered, "Thank you, Holly." Behind me, I heard gentle applause. It wasn't planned. The volunteers had gathered, silent, smiling, wanting me to know they saw me. I stood slowly and raised Holly's note. "This garden was never mine," I said. "It belonged to every one of you who believed it could grow." A few voices called their own memories. "You helped me. I still have my scholarship." And the hushed murmur became a chorus of gratitude. The sun climbed higher, warming my shoulders as I walked along the brick path. I paused at the greenhouse door, tracing the wavy glass panels we once assembled ourselves. A fresh wooden sign now hung above, "Irene Caldwell Legacy Garden." My name glowed, not as an ego stroke, but as a beacon for anyone who had felt unseen. A child pointed at the sign and whispered, "That's her." She didn't ask for recognition, but she received it. Later, I gathered everyone under the shade of the pergola. I held up Holly's note and said, "I never asked for applause. I only wanted to plant seeds." I looked around at bright eyes and weathered faces, each carrying a story I had helped start. "This garden isn't just about flowers," I continued. "It's about remembering that our small deeds matter. If you ever feel forgotten, come back here. You'll find a piece of yourself in the soil." Have you ever returned to a place you once built and found it flourishing without you? If you have, you know the feeling when the world finally whispers, "We remember you." Drop one word below, maybe home, and let someone know they're not alone. I spent the afternoon helping plant a new row of bluebells and lavender. Each glance down the garden path reminded me of lives tended, relationships nurtured, dreams given a chance. When the last seed was covered, I stood at the gate again. The garden stretched behind me like a promise fulfilled. As I paused by the old bench we installed, I placed Holly's note and a sprig of lavender on the plaque. The bench was carved with Edward's quote, "Plant truth and it will bloom in hearts." Seeing it next to my name on the sign reminded me that the story of this place had always been ours together. For a moment, I let the breeze carry my thoughts back to years when we quietly built something meaningful side by side. Walking to my car at dusk, I realized the victory wasn't in seeing my name in lights, but in watching lives grow strong enough to speak my name for me. And whenever someone asks, "Where did this garden's wonder come from?" they'll remember that a quiet woman who never demanded her turn planted the seeds that taught an entire community how to bloom. That thought will always be my tribute, my reward, my silent justice. I sat in the greenhouse at dawn, the first rays of sunlight glinting off dew on the lavender and rosemary. This was the place where my story began and, in a sense, where it would always end. Quiet, rooted in soil and memory. I held the sealed envelope Edward tucked behind his ledger, the earlier will he drafted with his own hand. I hadn't opened it until now. The wax seal broke with a soft crack, revealing crisp pages that named me as co-trustee, co-founder, equal partner in every chapter of the Desert Foundation. I let the paper rest on my lap, soaking in the proof that no court, no boardroom, no silent erasure could ever rewrite the heart of our legacy. I rose and placed the document gently back into its protective folder, then slid it into the lockbox alongside the original charter. There it would remain, not as evidence in a legal battle, but as a testament to truth preserved. The greenhouse felt alive around me. The curled petals, the budding stems, all reminders that what is planted with care will blossom in time, regardless of storms. I breathed in the warm, herbal air, letting it fill that empty space I once held for doubt and anger. Later, I walked out to the old community center garden one last time. The bench carved with Edward's favorite quote, "Plant truth, and it will bloom in hearts," sat under a canopy of bougainvillea. I traced the carved words with a fingertip, remembering how we built this together, how I had once felt invisible even in the soil I turned. Now, every flower carried someone's story, a student who became a teacher, a refugee who found refuge, a caregiver who rediscovered hope. They bloomed in my stead. From there, I made my way to the foundation's new office, glass and steel, a far cry from the dusty building I once helped patch up. I passed the lobby without hesitation, greeting the receptionist by name. She smiled and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell." It was a title I hadn't needed in years, yet it felt warm, like a long-lost friend calling me home. I didn't go to Amber's office. Instead, I headed down the hall to the archive room, where rows of folders told the story of 3 decades, outreach programs, scholarship names, community events. I ran my fingers along the spines, nodding at familiar projects I had forgotten until now. A young staffer paused in the doorway. "Mrs. Caldwell, we found a file we think you'd like to see," she said, holding out a manila envelope stamped "Original Documents." I smiled and took it gently. No fanfare, no camera bulbs, just the hush of a moment restored. We exchanged a quiet look of respect, and I slipped the file into my tote. Back home, I gathered a few personal items, Edward's old fountain pen, a faded photograph of us at the 10th anniversary banquet, and that sealed will. I placed them in a small wooden box beside my writing desk. Then I sat down and opened my journal, pen poised over blank pages. I didn't begin with legal arguments or snappy comebacks. I began with a simple line. Today, I remembered who I always was. I wrote about the greenhouse, the garden, the archive room, and the handwritten letters that kept coming. Testimonies of lives changed, futures saved, hope planted where there was none. I wrote about Amelia, who received her master's at 68, about Carlos, who started a literacy program in Guatemala, about young Rosa, now a nurse who still picks lavender to calm her mind before every shift. Each story was a petal in a bouquet I never expected to receive. I paused and looked out the window at the lemon tree we planted in 1994. Its branches bowed under their first fruit of the season. It was a reminder that growth takes time, and that sometimes the sweetest harvest comes long after the seed is sown. That evening, I lit a single candle in the study and sat by the window. The flame flickered against the darkening sky, and I thought of all the moments I spent in silence, believing that quiet was the same as absence. I realize now that silence can be powerful when it holds space for justice, for truth, for the gentle slowing down of a story until its final chapter finds peace. Before I closed my journal, I wrote one more line. Revenge isn't erasing the past, it's ensuring the future remembers. And with that, I set the pen aside and let the candle burn low. Have you ever reclaimed a piece of your own legacy? If you have a moment, share one word in the comments. Maybe it's remembered, it's rooted, or home. Your word might be the spark someone else needs to see that their story isn't over, and that their silent strength can blossom in its own time.